In 1A, the problem with the method of data collection is that it's a volunteer sample or a voluntary response sample, whatever you want to call that. Looking at what's there in the wording, the only people who could possibly end up in the sample would be visitors to CNN.com who elected to participate in the poll, hence volunteers. So since that's not a representative sample of drivers who visit CNN.com, wouldn't be able to generalize to them, and therefore wouldn't be able to generalize to all drivers either. In 1B, the thing you want to look at is what the possible values are for each individual. Granted, the summary value, the 34%, that's a number, but for this, that doesn't matter. The summary values are always going to be numbers, so don't let that throw you off. It's what the possible values are for each individual, and here the possible values are yes and no. Either they drove with a pet on their lap or they didn't. So that's not a number, it's not quantitative, so it's categorical. 2A, identifying the sample. The main thing here is to be descriptive enough, because the thing that would be kind of a trap is to just have the sample size, so just have the 2861. And granted, the 2861 is something you probably want to include, but that by itself is just not going to be enough. So something like what I have is about as exhaustive as you can make it, where I have the 2,861 Bloomberg Businessweek subscribers who were surveyed. Something like 2,861 Bloomberg Businessweek subscribers, just that part of it, that would be enough. But I think what you want here, generally when you're writing out a sample, include the sample size if you can. I think that's generally a good idea. And then describe what the individuals are a little bit. If this was a situation on a test and that was what a test question was, and somebody had an answer of just 2861, I would have to take off for that. You don't have to maybe have every single word that I have, but I think thinking about it like that is probably good going forward. The population then is going to be the superset of whatever your sample is. So this is one where you kind of have to infer it based on what's there in the wording, where you think, okay, the sample is a bunch of these things, where I guess here these things are Bloomberg Businessweek subscribers. And then you think, okay, well then the population must be all of them. And that's correct. It is going to be all of them. So something like all Bloomberg Businessweek subscribers, I think that would cover it, and that's pretty succinct. So something to that effect, that's what your population should be. 2C is identifying the variables, of which there are two. What they got from each subscriber in the sample was their annual income and whether or not that subscriber has an American Express card. So annual income, that's numeric, it's money, so that's going to be a number, so that's going to be a quantitative variable. The other one, the important thing I have underlined there, the whether or not a subscriber has an American Express card. Yes, that's going to be categorical. Either they do or they don't, that's not going to be a number. But the important thing, and this is the thing where if there's kind of a common mistake, this is what it would be, to not cover both sides of this. To just say something like having an American Express card. And that's part of it, and I guess realistically that's half of it, because that's one of the two possible options. So the reason I have the whether or not at the beginning is to cover both. Either they have one or they don't, and the whether or not covers that. And generally for a categorical variable, if it's one where it's an either or, whether it's a yes or no, or anything that's sort of binary, then typically you probably want to have a whether or not or something to that effect as sort of a safeguard to make sure that you cover both options. The first two parts of number 3 are identifying the explanatory and response variables for that experiment. The explanatory variable would be the one where we think maybe if we change that, then that would cause something to happen with the response variable. So here the explanatory variable involves having a stent, but this is just like that last part of number 2, where you want to make sure that you cover both possibilities, because not everybody is going to get a stent. So something like just having a stent would be half right. So I've got the whether or not in there in that first version up toward the top where it's written out verbally, whether a patient receives a stent or not. That way both options are covered. If you want to write it in shorthand where you kind of itemize the possible values, and that's what I have here, just stent, no stent, that's okay too. As long as you cover both options, I think that's fine. Part B, identifying the response variable, ends up being pretty similar, because this is going to be another categorical variable where it's an either or. So again, we have the whether or not, because either they have a stroke or they don't have a stroke. So the whether or not would cover both options there. And again, if you wanted to write that one in shorthand where you have the possible values itemized, stroke/no stroke, or stroke/no event if you mimic what's there in the wording. Either of those would be fine. Parts C, D, and E are checking to see if the study meets the experimental standard. So the first thing is, were the subjects randomly assigned to treatments? It's toward the top. It's above where it has treatment group in bold. Right above that, the second sentence, it starts with each volunteer patient was randomly assigned. So there's the random assignment. So there's the reference right there, and that is going to be true. Part D, to check to see if the experiment was double blind, you do have a single blind where the patients wouldn't know what they were getting, but the employees involved with medical management did. It's at the very end of the indented part. So under control group, all the way down to the very last indented thing, employees involved in medical management knew which patients did and did not receive stents. Because of that, it's not going to be double blind. Part E, checking for the placebo effect, making sure that was accounted for. That is accounted for here, and really there are two references that you need from the wording. So underneath the control group heading, right away, that patients in the control group receive the same medical management as patients in the treatment group. That's good. You want to keep everything consistent if you're going to account for the placebo effect. But there's also another piece, which is actually in the next sentence, where it says, suppose a small incision was made on a wrist of every patient in the control group. That way, people who are in the control group, who are getting the placebo treatment, can't immediately identify that they're getting it. So you need that piece too. So really part E is a little more complex because there are two references that pertain to it in the wording, but it is taken care of. The placebo effect is accounted for in the study.